They were the first children to fall asleep to the hum of the television. The 1970s were not just a decade, they were a threshold, a suspended moment between the ideals of their parents and the disillusionment that followed. Those who grew up then carry a quiet complexity, shaped by hope, tempered by reality. They were raised in a world that seemed to wake up from its own dream, blinking into a harsher, clearer light. And what that light revealed left marks, gentle, invisible, permanent. They were the children of transition. Their parents had known war, or at least its shadow. They believed in institutions, in order, in progress, as a promise. But by the 1970s, that promise began to fracture. Governments were questioned, religion was doubted, movements for equality rose and splintered at the same time. To grow up then was to grow up amid the noise of things falling apart and the whisper of something new trying to begin. For many, childhood felt like living between worlds, between analog and digital, between collective duty and individual freedom, between hope and fear. Television became a teacher, radio became a confidant that learned about the world through music that questioned everything, songs about peace, about love, about rebellion. Yet beneath the melodies was the constant awareness of inflation, energy crises, and cultural disillusionment. They learned early that beauty often grows in the same soil as struggle. Those who grew up in the 1970s carry a poetic kind of resilience. They learned how to adapt to shifting values, shifting technologies, shifting truths. Adaptability became a quiet superpower, but also a quiet unease. When the world keeps changing, you'll learn how to move with it, but you can also lose your sense of where you belong. Many still carry that question. Who am I between what was and what's coming? If this feels familiar, stay with me. They learned independence not as rebellion, but as necessity. Many were latchkey kids before the term existed, coming home to empty houses, heating their own meals, watching television alone until their parents returned. That solitude became both comfort and scar tissue. It taught capability, but it also taught that closeness could not be assumed. Later in life, this showed up as self reliance that borders on distance. People who can handle everything on their own, but struggle to ask for help. You can still see it in how they love. They show care through action, not words, fixing things, providing stability, being reliable. They believe love should be proven, not performed. This came from watching a generation before them prioritize survival over expression. Emotions were private, sometimes even shameful. So they grew up half fluent in feeling. They know what they feel, but don't always know how to say it. There's a tenderness in that silence. Many wanted to speak, to express, to belong, but the world was loud with adults trying to redefine everything. And so they learned to read rooms, sense moods, anticipate needs. Emotional intelligence became a survival tool, especially for those whose parents were chasing freedom or recovering from disappointment. Children of the 1970s often became the emotional glue in their families, quiet peacemakers who learned that harmony was their responsibility. That's why, as adults, many struggle to rest. They feel a silent pressure to hold things together even when no one asks. It isn't control they seek, it's safety. They learned early that safety is not given, it's built. So they became builders of order, steady presences in unstable environments. But beneath that calm lies a longing to be taken care of with the same steadiness they once offered. Their world growing up was tactile records, books, paper, letters, rotary phones. Connection required effort, patience, presence. So when the digital age arrived, they carried with them a nostalgia for the physical, for things that could be touched, repaired, held. This shaped their psychology. They seek meaning through time, commitment, continuity. They don't just consume, they invest. Every friendship, every object, every idea is something to maintain because that's how they learn love works. You fix, you keep, you stay. And yet they also grew up witnessing the first massive waves of freedom, feminism, civil rights, sexual liberation. Here lies the paradox. They were told to dream of freedom, but warned of its cost. They watched adults chase self expression and end up isolated. They saw marriages collapse under the weight of new ideals. They learned that freedom can liberate and isolate. Many still carry that internal negotiation, how to be independent without being alone. They witnessed the rise of mass media and the slow erosion of privacy. The world began watching itself. Appearance started to matter, not out of vanity, but judgment. They learned to curate themselves long before social media existed. They became skilled at managing impressions, often at the cost of feeling truly seen. Beneath that lies a quiet fear, invisibility. They grew up in an increasingly crowded world. More voices, more change, more noise. To be noticed required something talent, rebellion, distinction. But to be too different risked rejection. So many learned to live in the middle, expressive enough to belong, restrained enough to stay safe. The middle ground became their emotional home, comfortable but incomplete. This is why nostalgia lives so deeply in them, not as escape but as remembrance, a memory of a time when life felt slower, clearer, more tangible. Their relationship with authority is complicated. They watch governments fall, corporations rise, ideals shift. Skepticism became self protection. Yet beneath it all, they still want to believe in something solid, something worthy of loyalty. That's why they oscillate between hope and cynicism. They don't mock the chaos of the world. They know it has always existed. When they came of age in the 1980s and 1990s, they carried that balance forward, realism with heart, skepticism with soul. They worked hard, saved, adapted. But in quiet moments, many wonder if life became more about maintaining than living, because the 1970s taught them how to endure, not always how to receive. Every resilience casts a shadow. When you learn early to self soothe, self manage, self protect, you also learn to self isolate. Many who grew up in the 1970s carry the belief that needing others is weakness, not from pride, from history. They watched systems fail, relationships fracture, so they built an inner fortress, strong, steady, beautiful, lonely. This is the paradox of their maturity. Emotionally rich, yet privately burdened. They understand others deeply, but rarely allow themselves to be understood. Somewhere inside, the child of the 1970s still whispers, don't be too much, don't ask for too much, don't expect too much. That whisper came from a world trying to stay afloat, and now it's beginning to soften because they are the bridge generation, those who remember life before acceleration and learned how to adapt when it arrived. They carry the wisdom of slowness in a world addicted to speed. They know the value of waiting, of patience, of time, but something deeper is stirring now, a quiet reevaluation. What if survival is no longer the goal? What if trust could return, not in systems or promises, but in connection itself? They are the keepers of analog memory in the digital world. The last generation to grow up believing mystery belonged to life, that not everything needed to be known, shared, or solved. There is calm in that. You can recognize them by their quiet observation. They don't rush to react. They pause, they think before speaking. They were taught that reflection is a form of respect, but that restraint can make them seem distant. They fear saying the wrong thing in a world that records everything. So they choose silence even when their hearts are full. Inside, though, lies deep emotional literacy. They know loneliness. They know unspoken responsibility. They know that the truest forms of love are often wordless. That's why their empathy runs deep, not loud, but steady. Their children often describe them as reliable, but hard to read. That is the inheritance of the 1970s, the ability to care deeply while remaining contained. They grew up during a shift in emotional expression without a map. They learned restraint from their parents and openness from the world that followed. From that tension, they forged a quiet language of affection. To understand them is to understand compromise. They were raised on contradictions, tradition and rebellion, optimism and fear, connection and independence. This gave them range, the ability to hold opposites without breaking. That's why they often become mediators, the voices of reason, the ones who can see all sides. But that balance sometimes costs them clarity about what they want. They learn to adapt. So they adapted again and again to new jobs, new technologies, new cultural tides. Adaptability became identity. Yet beneath it all, many long for stillness, for something that doesn't need to change. The 1970s planted that longing because everything seemed in motion, and from that instability came creativity. Many of the world's most innovative thinkers, artists, and leaders were shaped by that decade's contradictions. When nothing is certain, imagination becomes safety. They dreamed to survive, they created to belong. But survival through imagination has its cost. For many, reality feels muted compared to the depth of their inner vision. It isn't bitterness, it's recognition. They saw immense potential, and some part of them still aches for the world that could have been. That ache is why they value authenticity so deeply. They recognize pretense instantly. They've worn masks themselves, not to deceive, but to survive. They understand the price of fitting in, the cost of peacekeeping, the quiet exhaustion of always being the reasonable one. Many carry an inner fatigue from decades of adjusting to others. They may not notice it, it simply feels like duty. But beneath it lies a wish to rest, to finally exhale. There are people of depth disguised as pragmatists. They speak simply, they think profoundly. They don't need grand gestures, they need sincerity. Because sincerity was rare in the noise of the 1970s. Too many promises, too many slogans, too many reinventions. They learn to trust not what people say, but how they show up over time. That's why consistency feels like love to them. They don't chase intensity, they seek reliability. And that makes them vulnerable in a world that celebrates speed, novelty, and noise. They often feel unseen, not because they are quiet, but because the world has forgotten how to listen at the frequency they speak. If you've ever met someone who feels grounded, slightly mysterious, and quietly safe, someone who doesn't overshare, but whose presence feels honest, you've met the soul of the 1970s. They watched the world lose its innocence and continue anyway. And now, a new chapter is unfolding. Many are rediscovering softness, realizing that strength without vulnerability is just endurance. They're unlearning the silence that once protected them. They're beginning to speak, not to perform, but to connect. They're learning that it is safe to need, to feel, to be seen. This awakening is not loud. It's like dusk light through old curtains, gentle, steady, familiar. Because the truth is, they never stopped longing for authenticity. They just didn't know it was allowed. Those who grew up in the 1970s are entering a reflective season now, not an ending, a reckoning. They ask new questions. What did all that endurance cost me? What did I protect that didn't need protecting? What do I still believe in after everything has changed? They're realizing that healing is not rebellion, it's permission. They listen again to the music that raised them. Once it was about changing the world. Now it's about coming home to themselves. This is the psychology of those who grew up in the 1970s. People who learn that truth and tenderness can coexist, who carry contradictions not as burdens, but as maps. They are witnesses to a turning century, and perhaps that is their greatest contribution, showing that it is possible to remain human through change. Because to grow up in the 1970s was to learn this. The world will always reinvent itself. What remains is how we care, how we remember, how we keep trying to love even when we are tired. In Mobile, somewhere inside that tiredness, the same quiet hope still lives, the gentle human belief that tomorrow can still surprise us.